HbA1c, hemoglobin A1c. If you've had any kind of diabetes screening, you have seen this number. It's probably the single most ordered test for blood sugar in the world. And most people, including health workers, treat it like it's the final word on someone's blood sugar control. And in many ways, it is genuinely a useful test. But it's also a test with some blind spots. Blind spots that, if you don't know them, can give you a false sense of security and, in some cases, an inaccurate result altogether. Today, I want to break down exactly what HbA1c is measuring, what it does well, and just as importantly, what it cannot tell you. Because there are situations, some of which are quite common in our part of the world, where the test can be completely misleading. And I think every person should know about this before they look at that number on their lab report and assume it's telling them the full story. Let's start with the basics. HbA1c stands for glycated hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein inside your red blood cells that carries oxygen around your body. When glucose is in your bloodstream, some of it attaches to that hemoglobin, a process called glycation. The more glucose that's been floating around in your blood, the more of it sticks to your hemoglobin. And red blood cells live for roughly 2 to 3 months before they are replaced. So when we measure HbA1c, what we are really measuring is the percentage of your red blood cells that has glucose stuck to them, which gives you an average picture of your blood sugar over the past 2 to 3 months. Genuinely, that is useful. A single fasting glucose test is a snapshot of a single moment. HbA1c gives you something closer to a rolling average. That's why it has become the standard for diagnosing and monitoring diabetes. And HbA1c below 5.7% is considered normal. Between 5.7 and 6.4 is considered prediabetes, and 6.5% and above is consistent with diabetes. So far, this sounds like a great test, and really, for a lot of people, it is. But here is where things get complicated. The first major limitation of HbA1c is built right into how it works. It is an average, and averages can hide enormous variations. Let's picture two people. Person A has relatively stable blood sugar throughout the day. It goes up a little after meals, comes back down, and stays in a fairly narrow range. Person B's blood sugar swings dramatically, big spikes after meals, sometimes climbing very high, then crashing down below between meals. If you average out person A blood sugar over 3 months, and you average out person B blood sugar over the same 3 months, you could get the exact same HbA1c. Maybe both comes out 5.6%, both technically normal. But these are not the same persons metabolically. Person B is experiencing repeated spikes that are putting stress on blood vessels, that are driving inflammation, that are likely accompanied by much higher insulin output than person A. Over years, person B is on a very different trajectory, even though their HbA1c looks identical. This is actually a topic I'll be covering in much more depth in a different video, because it's one of the most important concepts in understanding your own metabolic health. The idea that average and stability are two completely different things. HbA1c can only tell you about average. Now here is the part I think is more important for our audience specifically, because it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Remember, HbA1c depends on red blood cells living their normal lifespan of around 2 to 3 months, so that glucose has to accumulate on them. But anything that changes how long red blood cells live or changes the hemoglobin itself can throw this number off, sometimes significantly. And there are conditions that are far more common in West Africa than in the populations where a lot of these testing were originally standardized. Sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease is one example. Other hemoglobin variants like hemoglobin C are more prevalent in our region. In people with these variants, red blood cells often have a shorter lifespan than normal, which means there is less time for hemoglobin to accumulate, and HbA1c can come back artificially low. Someone could have an HbA1c that looks perfectly normal, while their actual blood sugar control is considerably worse than the numbers suggest. The same issues can come up with G6PD deficiency, which is also common here, and with anything that causes ongoing blood loss or increased red blood cell turnover, including chronic conditions like malaria, which remains relevant in much of our region. On the flip side, conditions that cause red blood cells to live longer than usual, certain types of anemia for instance, can push HbA1c to artificially higher than your actual blood sugar would suggest. I want to be very clear. This does not mean that HbA1c is useless for people with these conditions, but it does mean if you have a known hemoglobin variant, or if your HbA1c doesn't seem to match your symptoms or your other lab markers, that's a signal to look further, not to simply accept the number at face value. So, if HbA1c has these blind spots, what should you be looking at alongside it? Fasting glucose still has value. It's a different kind of snapshot, and when paired with HbA1c, the two together give you more information than either alone. If they are telling you very different stories, for example, a normal HbA1c, but a fasting glucose that's creeping up, that's worth paying attention to. Fasting insulin. I covered this in a previous video. Fasting insulin gives you information that HbA1c simply cannot, because HbA1c only reflects glucose, not how much insulin your body had to produce to manage that glucose. And for anyone with a known hemoglobin variant, sickle cell trait for example, a fructosamine test can be a useful alternative. Fructosamine reflects glucose control over a much shorter window, around 2 to 3 weeks, and it's not affected by red blood cells lifespan in the same way HbA1c is. It is not ordered as often, but it's worth knowing it exists, particularly for anyone whose HbA1c results have never quite matched the rest of their clinical picture. HbA1c is a genuinely valuable test. It is not something to be dismissed, and for most people, it remains one of the better tools for tracking blood sugar over time. But valuable and complete are not the same thing. It's an average, which means it can hide dangerous variability. And for a meaningful portion of our population, anyone with sickle cell trait, other hemoglobin variants, G6PD deficiency, or conditions affecting red blood cell lifespan, it can be genuinely inaccurate. So the next time you get this test done, don't just look at the number and feel relieved or alarmed based on that alone. Look at it alongside your fasting glucose, ideally alongside fasting insulin. And if you have any non-blood disorders, mention that to whoever is interpreting your results, because it changes how that result should be read. One number hardly tells you the full story. That's true for HbA1c. And honestly, it's true for almost every lab marker we will cover in this channel.